Welcome everybody who is just joining us to the inaugural event of the River Newsroom's Climate Lab. We have a great panel for you today. And it is 5 o'clock. All right, let's go. So, hi, I'm Lissa. I'm the staff writer at the River Newsroom. And welcome to the River and welcome to the Climate Lab. This is our new project where we are going to be doing locally focused, solutions-oriented journalism about climate change impacts and climate change solutions in the Hudson Valley and Catskills region. I'm really excited to be doing this work, and I'm excited to be at the River. We are a scrappy, growing news outlet, a project of Chronogram magazine, and our mission is to go deep on local and regional stories that tie into larger national or global issues. I've been with the River personally since last March. They brought me on to cover COVID-19, and at the time we said, let's keep doing this as long as the emergency lasts, and I ended up covering COVID-19 for more than a year. So now shifting gears to climate because I can't get enough of really complicated disasters, apparently. But you know, that's been kind of my beat for a while. Some of you, if you're Catskills or Catskills adjacent, might remember the Watershed Post, which I ran from 2010 to 2017. And in that time, I think kind of the most significant thing that has happened to me as a reporter, you know, in a lot of ways as a member of the community, was covering Hurricane Irene, the flooding and the aftermath of that. And I have a background in science writing and in environmental policy and you know, a lot of things that are relevant to climate change. But I think being here for Hurricane Irene flooding was really kind of the formative experience of my career. It's informed how I look at climate change and how I think about what journalism is for. And this kind of brings me to the issue of solutions. You know, we're talking about solutions journalism with the Climate Lab, and with a lot of the Rivers reporting, we're aiming to do more of that. There's a growing movement within journalism that says it's not enough to just write about the bad things that happen. You know, of course, we need to know what's broken, but we need to bring our focus and our talents and our journalistic rigor to the efforts to fix what's broken, and you know, to the most fiendishly complicated problems that are facing our communities. We need to help communities tackle these problems in a productive way. And you know, it's not just about telling good news stories. People in solutions journalism talk about hope with teeth. You know, we want to do this with rigor, and we want to talk about the promise of solutions and also challenges. You know, what are the limitations? What's standing in our way? Where are the biggest challenges going to lie in our efforts to solve some of these fiendishly complicated problems? And so tonight we have this terrific slate of people who are all in the local area, all actively engaged in working on some of the toughest problems that we have on decarbonization of energy at various sectors of the economy, of resilience, of what our economy is going to look like and what our communities and our infrastructure is going to look like, and how we can adapt to the change that is absolutely coming, and try to stave off some of the worst of it. So I'm delighted that we have all of these folks here tonight. I'm very delighted also to have as a co-moderator former State Senator Jen Metzger, who is going to give us an overview of the climate policy landscape in New York, which is really interesting right now. And then we're going to turn it over to our panelists. So before I do that, I just want to give an obligatory plug for and a shout out to thank everyone who does. Please support the River Newsroom. Thank you to all of our supporting members, and thank you to everyone who has tossed us a couple of bucks to be here tonight. And I appreciate all of our supporters. And with that, I will turn it over to Jen. Jen Metzger served in the New York State Senate in 2019 to 2020. She currently advises on climate and energy policy with New Yorkers for Clean Power. It's a nonprofit organization. And before she was elected to state senate, she served for more than a decade in local government in the town of Rosendale and co-founded and directed Citizens for Local Power, an organization dedicated to fighting unfair utility rates and practices and helping communities shift to a locally based clean energy economy. In the state senate, Senator Metzger was a leading voice for action to tackle climate change, move away from reliance on fossil fuels, and increase job-creating clean energy investments. She was an active member of the Senate's work group on the nation-leading Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was signed into New York state law in July 2019. And she led efforts in the state legislature to create a permanent ban on fracking, which was passed as part of the budget in 2020. Senator Metzger also introduced a number of bills to tackle climate change and encourage clean energy investments and practices, including the Freedom from Fossil Fuels Act, banning new fossil fuel infrastructure, a package of legislation to support and expand clean transportation, a bill creating a carbon farming tax credit to promote healthy soils and sequester carbon, legislation to reduce high utility fixed charges, and bills to improve recycling and encourage reuse. So thank you, Jen, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. And, you know, it's so great to be here. And I want to thank the river and just let you all know how excited I am about the climate lab. That is like exactly what we need right now. First of all, you know, we've got such a great panel tonight. A lot of our panelists, I know, they've really been working to help build a resilient, sustainable, healthy, and thriving Hudson Valley. And now more than ever, we really need to be bold and creative and harness all of our collective will and energies to addressing the climate crisis and building that resilience to the changes that are occurring. And you know, we have to transform our economy in a pretty fundamental way because it still runs primarily on fossil fuels. And unfortunately, we have already seen the profound consequences of climate change. The heat waves in the Pacific Northwest were previously unfathomable and were made, according to scientists, 150 more times more likely because of climate change. So, you know, it's a real wake-up call for us. We've got a lot of work to do to slow the train down and build community resilience. But on the bright side, and there really is a bright side, there are solutions, as Lisa alluded to in the beginning. And I look forward to hearing about all the interesting work everyone's doing tonight. The kinds of changes we have to make to reduce greenhouse gas emissions have so many other benefits for our communities that are worthy of action for their own sake. You know, they include, you know, creating healthier communities, creating like family sustaining good quality jobs, reducing energy costs, becoming truly energy independent, getting off of dirty imported fossil fuels, preserving our natural resources that make the Hudson Valley such an incredible place to live. So the opportunities for change, you know, I really feel are incredibly exciting. You know, as Lisa mentioned, I was working on climate and energy at the local level for a number of years. And it was really like, I felt so incredibly fortunate to be in the state Senate at a moment when we could really move the needle in a major way at the state level. And at the federal level, we had been going backwards. So it was particularly important. You know, we passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act in 2019. At the time, it was the most ambitious climate legislation in the country and also the most equitable. New York has committed in law to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030. That's in less than 9 years, and reaching net zero emissions by 2050. We also required that by 2030, we generate 70% of our electricity from renewable sources and have an entirely carbon-free electricity system by 2040. And importantly, at least 35% 5% of the benefits of clean energy investments have to go to disadvantaged communities, with the goal of 40%, which is really, frankly, the number we're all working with and pushing for. Low-income communities, communities of color have suffered disproportionately from the environmental harm society has wrought to date. And this provision is truly essential in making sure that our clean energy transition in New York is just and equitable. This provision, by the way, was picked up by President Biden for his own climate plan. So New York has really been a model, and I was thrilled to see that would be a federal goal as well. But now this is like where the rubber hits the road, and we have to implement this law. The climate law created a 22-member climate action council, which is charged with drafting a scoping plan for the state to meet these targets. The law also established a climate justice working group to make sure that the equity provisions and targets are being met, a just transition working group, and 7 advisory panels in specific areas impacting emissions: power generation, transportation, agriculture and forestry, energy efficiency, and housing, among others. And these bodies have been meeting and working on recommendations through 2020 and into 2021. And as of last month, the advisory panels have now all presented their recommendations to the Climate Action Council. And the next step of the process is to do what's called an integration analysis, integrating all of these recommendations to make sure they're getting us to where we need to be. And I imagine it will be an iterative process. I'm sure there will be changes along the way, but the draft scoping plan is required to be completed this year. It's required that a minimum of 6 public hearings are held around the state on that draft plan before the final version is completed, finalized, adopted in 2022. So that's like the quick overview of the climate law and where we are in the planning process to date. I just want to spend just a few minutes kind of about where we are in meeting our targets and where we have to go, but I will not have time to touch on every sector. But I do want to start with the electricity sector because it's so important for reasons I'll explain. But we're actually making good progress in getting to our goal of 70% renewable electricity by 2030. New York had already put a clean energy standard in place in 2016, requiring utilities and energy supply companies to procure like increasing amounts of renewable energy over time. The goal back then was to get to 50% renewable generation. Now the climate law is up to 70. So after its adoption, the clean energy standard was revised to reflect that new goal. And to see how far we've come, it's helpful to kind of see where we started. When the CLCPA was adopted, about 28% of our electricity was from renewable sources, most of that from existing hydropower. Only about 4%, 5% is from solar and wind. As of today, we're at about 50% counting projects that either built, have been built, are being built, or are in contract. So we're well on our way to that 70% goal, but we still need 24,000 gigawatts of renewables to get us to where we need to be by that date. A state law was passed in 2020 to expedite the review process for larger projects to within 1 year, which is significantly faster than the previous process. This law has not been without controversy. It's upset local communities who feel that home rule is being steamrolled. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to balance local priorities and input, but also keep us on track to meet those goals. And in addition to that's like the larger projects, but we also need to really ramp up investment in the smaller scale projects, from like rooftop solar to the kinds of community renewable projects Rich Winter is going to talk about tonight and does. And we really need both. We need a mix of large scale and small scale to get to a carbon-free grid. And the good news is that the price of solar has come down by nearly 70% in the last decade, which is pretty extraordinary and bodes well for a clean energy future. So renewable development is proceeding apace. New York really has to stop issuing permits for new fossil fuel infrastructure. Boggles my mind that the state has not yet rejected the proposed new frack gas dance camera power plant in Orange County. And I encourage folks on the Zoom today to submit comments to the DEC on the draft permits for this plant and for the proposed Astoria NRG plant in Queens. They're accepting comments through the end of August. But in my humble opinion, it's entirely inconsistent with our climate goals. Cleaning up the grid is so important because key climate solutions to emissions in other sectors require electricity. Two of these sectors, transportation and buildings, together account for about 2/3 of New York's greenhouse gas emissions. For transportation, the switch to electric vehicles is going to be really critical. And actually this session, the state legislature passed a bill requiring that any car or light duty vehicle sold in New York be emissions free by 2035. This is consistent with California's law. It's as strong as we can go because of federal preemption issues. It's a very important bill. Now the governor needs to sign it in case anyone wants to drop him an email, urging him to do so. But we also have to build out the charging infrastructure, as well as expand investments in public transportation and creating more walkable and bikeable communities. And again, these are critical parts of the solution, and they also provide so many other benefits, like in terms of public health and expanding access to educational and employment opportunities by providing affordable ways to get around. So again, multiple benefits to the communities of these solutions. Probably the toughest nut to crack in New York from an emissions perspective is the building sector. It's a big chunk of our state's emissions, accounting for about 30% of direct emissions, because we combust fossil fuels in our homes to heat our homes, and hot water to cook, some of us to dry our clothes. Eliminating these emissions will require that every building eventually switch to zero emissions technologies like heat pumps. And it's going to also require major investments to weatherize and tighten up the building envelope, as Melinda Mcknight will certainly talk about later in this panel. But I just want to say that the Energy Efficiency and Housing Advisory Panel to the Climate Action Council made some really important recommendations on this, including recommending requirements for all electric buildings in new construction, beginning in 2025 for single family homes. I think it was 2027 for multifamily and commercial. And then in 2030, they recommend requiring zero emission standards for the replacement of oil and gas systems in existing buildings at the end of useful life. So 2030 for single family, 2035 for multifamily and commercial buildings. So if this goes into effect, in 2030, if your boiler is kaput, you would have to invest in zero emissions technologies like heat pumps. So those targets are set out far enough in the future to send the signals to the market, to create to make sure that we are have the supplies to meet these requirements. So that's why having certain dates is important. So I've got one more minute. So there's so much more to cover, and I haven't even touched on agriculture, which I'll handily leave to Ben Dobson. But I just want to say that, I just want to leave you with this. New York has passed a really nation-leading climate law. I believe we can also lead the nation in implementing the solutions that will get us to those goals. There's a lot of work to do in a fairly short period of time, but we do have solutions, and there's already been a lot of pioneering work done right here in our region. So I look forward to hearing from all our panelists, learning from you, and to a great discussion. So thanks so much, Lisa.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. And you mentioned Dan Scammer, and we literally just this afternoon published an article touching on that, and people can go to therivernewsroom.com and check it out. And Philip has dropped a link to that also in the chat here. Wonderful. So yeah, without further ado, I am going to introduce Scenic Hudson's Nava Tabak. Nava is Director of Science, Climate, and Stewardship at Scenic Hudson, and her job is to provide science-based guidance for the organization's work to protect biodiversity and working lands and to enhance climate resilience, which is, a really important piece of this work, is not just bringing emissions down, but making sure that our communities are resilient so that we are, ready for the impacts that are already present, that are already arriving, and that are going to continue to accelerate. So Nava's work includes understanding and adapting to sea level rise along the Hudson, promoting smart renewable energy siting, which, as Jen said, is a very live issue in our region, and natural climate solutions across the region, protecting climate resilient lands, and working with urban communities to adapt to climate impacts. So Nava, will you enlighten us?
Thanks, and thanks everyone who's taking time this evening to tune in. First, I would just like to say that I'll be representing work that myself and many of my colleagues do. I don't do all of these things. Just in case anyone is not familiar with Scenic Hudson, we're a regional non-for-profit organization working here in the Hudson Valley, and we are both a land trust and an advocacy organization, so people may know us from some of our waterfront parks, and other people might know us from standing up with us to advocate for certain issues. And what you may not know is that, just as Jen said, she believes that New York can be a leader on getting to these climate goals. We and our partners in the Hudson Valley believe that the Hudson Valley can be a leader and a model to reaching climate resilience for the rest of the state. And so we've actually taken up the mantle of both adapting to climate change impacts and mitigating them for several years now at Scenic Hudson. And I'll just touch briefly on a few of the ways that we go about doing this, and some other folks on the panel will get more in depth on some of these. So one thing we work on is natural climate solutions, and that is just a term for the fact that our lands that are not developed, that have some vegetation on them, typically do a lot of the work of taking up our emissions. And so they are part of the solution to reducing our emissions. And global research at the global scale shows that they are a really important part of the solution and can constitute more than a third of reaching the goal of avoiding a 2% or capping our temperature rise at 2%. And so that's huge. We need to protect these lands. We need to manage them properly. And in some cases, we need to restore them. So Scenic Hudson as a land trust has already been doing some of that land protection, but now we integrate climate resilience and prioritize places that are the biggest engines for taking up carbon and other greenhouse gases into our land protection efforts. We are also convening scientists and policymakers and land manager in a group we call the Northeast Carbon Alliance, which again convenes people to share science, collaborate, and also work together on promoting some policy solutions. And we do also own quite a bit of land, so we are looking at ways to manage our own lands and to model that kind of management that helps to take up as much carbon as possible. The second thing we focus on is sea level rise for those communities directly along the estuarine part of the Hudson River, which stretches all the way up to the Federal Dam in Troy. Sea level rise is one of the most forefront impacts of climate change. And so we have created a sea level rise mapper that allows people to visualize the projected sea level rise all the way out to the year 2100. We've used the underlying data from that to also research how tidal wetlands, which by the way, are some of the biggest natural climate solution engines, right up there with forests, or even more so in taking up carbon. So we've looked at how they will fare with sea level rise and have come up with a strategy to protect them and even to promote their ability to move inland so that we continue to have tidal wetlands into the future. And we also have done a lot of work with individual waterfront communities to plan for their waterfronts. We also do this kind of planning for our own parks and our own shorelines to make them resilient. And we now help convene a group of these waterfront communities that are most at risk called the Flood Resilience Network. The third thing I want to mention is while we work on forests and wetlands and also agricultural lands, which I haven't mentioned because I'd like to leave that to Ben as part of the natural climate solution, we are doing more work than ever in the part of the Hudson Valley. It's about 15% of the Hudson Valley that is more developed. Our cities, for instance, where we are working on improving and adding green spaces, on tree planting, on sort of highlighting and making streams front and center in our cities as corridors and walkways, adding trails, helping with city planning to make cities more walkable and bikeable. These are all things that are really important for climate mitigation, for reducing our emissions, but as Jen also mentioned, have other benefits to these communities. Also things like starting urban farms and running urban farms. And the last piece I want to touch on is this renewable energy piece. As Jen mentioned, we are part of the coalition that's leading the fight against the Dan Scammer power plant, which is, goes, like Jen said, completely counter to what the state is trying to do in terms of energy goals. But we're also very active in helping to site solar energy. So in the Hudson Valley, our contribution to renewable energy will be almost entirely based on solar. We don't have a lot of wind resources. We're not going to be damming up the Hudson River to generate new hydropower. So, and as Jen said, it's going to take rooftops and community solar, but it's also going to take some large solar developments. So we've weighed in on some of the largest solar developments to date and helped to improve their layout and reduce their impact. Hopefully they're still being reviewed. We've weighed in on the new accelerated renewable energy siting standards. And we've also created an online tool called the Solar Mapping Tool that helps communities by giving them all of the relevant tools for thinking about siting solar energy, all in one tool that they can explore to help them not only find, argue against solar development, but find the places where some of these solar developments really could go with not a lot of impact. So that's a taste of all of our work, and I will pass it back now for whoever's next. Thanks.
Oh, we have a question here in the chat of the 25% additional generation capacity you noted towards that 50% figure. How much of that will be utility scale above 25 gigawatts?
I think that was directed toward me.
Was that for you? I'm not exactly sure.
But that's a good question. My assumption was that that was large scale procurements, but New York also has a goal of reaching like 6. I think it's 6. It's a far smaller goal for distributed renewable energy, and we're about halfway there as well. But I think that is just for the large scale targets. But I will check.
And additionally, how do we assure that, and I'd like to circle back to this maybe when we get to Rich, how do we ensure that we're creating union jobs? Solar has historically been bad for labor in New York. There's a lot of really thorny topics to tackle with solar siting, and with this emerging marketplace. And I'd like to get into that. I would like to ask Nava. Particularly intrigued by the Flood Resilience Network and work with communities. And, I'm wondering, what is there a community that stands out to you as being really proactive and engaging with this work of making their vulnerable waterfronts more resilient. And, you know, just a brief few words on what they're doing.
Yeah, there's quite a few, and I don't want to pick favorites, but I will. No, but what I'll do is I'll mention the few that have been themselves leading this flood resilience network, along with partners like Scenic Hudson and state agencies. So the village of Piermont, the city of Kingston, and the village of Catskill, they have all undertaken really deep dives into what the future looks like and very serious planning exercises. I know that other communities have done the same since. I'm just most familiar with these communities because we were part of their planning. But really, I note them because they are also, again, like I said, taking the lead to help convene the other communities. They're in fact the ones who told those of us who work with them, you know, we want to bring other communities into this group. We want to share what we learn. We want to learn from other people. You know, the village of Catskill got tired of being compared to the resources that the city of Kingston had, you know, being a small village in a big city. So now there's other villages, you know, Hastings, all kinds of participants, Athens, up and down the river. And they're approaching it in different ways. Some are using the Climate Smart Communities program as a way to kind of examine their flood risk. Others are have done other kinds of assessments with the Nature Conservancy and the Hudson River Watershed Alliance. So there's all kinds of different ways to go about, but each of them start by really assessing their risk, and then from there making plans for adaptation.
Thanks so much, Nava. Jen, do you want to introduce our next panelists?
Yes. Fun. So I was trying to find the answer, which I still haven't found yet. I just want to mention we do have a target of 6 gigawatts of distributed renewable energy by 2025. And I know we're halfway to that target, but I'm trying to find out if it's included in the 50% or separate. But so very excited to introduce our next panelist, who I was introduced to when I chaired the Agriculture Committee in the Senate, and just found the work he is doing so exciting. And that is Ben Dobson. He's co-founder of Hudson Hemp and executive director of Hudson Carbon, an on-farm research laboratory dedicated to researching the ecological impacts of regenerative organic agriculture. Ben and his team are currently developing a marketplace to help regenerative farmers and ecosystem stewards receive payment for their positive impacts, which is really critical to making that transition more widely in agriculture. So Ben, take it away.
I thank you so much for having me on today. It's really an honor to be here, and I wanted to reiterate, I think that the Hudson Valley is a place where we can set an example for the state, and the state setting an example for the country. And I feel that it takes an integrated approach where energy policy, and our use of fossil fuels comes first, but then, as Nava brought up, we have ecological solutions as well. And if we're trying to address an issue like carbon, we have to look at the carbon cycle. Where is it being emitted? Where's it being sequestered? And we have to understand too that carbon is not just a bad thing, but we've put it into imbalance. And for the last 8 years now, I've been working in Livingston, New York, first implementing a transition from conventional GMO corn and soy production to organic production, building a supply chain for the organic crops we grow. And what we ended up doing is building a grain and forage supply chain to support smaller farmers who sell their food directly to eaters, retailers, and restaurants. And along the way, in 2015, just the second year of our transition, we started Hudson Carbon and established 15 permanent research sites across the farm to monitor the impact on soil carbon down to a meter deep, on temporary carbon stored in biomass, on nutrient leaching. And we continue to use the farm to push the envelope on practices. So we started going from a 2-year conventional grain rotation to a 4-year organic rotation. Then we added 3 years of perennials, so we have a 7-year rotation. And now we're planting more and more trees and starting to work more and more to understand our forests and wetlands on the farm. And it's been wonderful collaborating some with Scenic Hudson, whose work I think is terrific, and Jen with you and Dee Dee Barrett on writing the bill. So right now we're at a time where we are taking this work we've done, and we're developing a methodology that we're submitting to the major carbon registries in the country for monitoring soil carbon, measuring soil carbon. And we're beginning to correlate that with satellite data and models so that it can be brought to scale. And we've also started working in other regions in desert agriculture, monitoring the impact of carbon sequestration in agaves and plants that sequester carbon at night and close their stomata during the day. We're working on grasslands in Montana, and we'll be starting to work on silvopasture in Brazil. But our home base is right here. Our lab is actually called the Scenic Hudson Soil Carbon Lab because Scenic Hudson helped us with the initial steps. And our ultimate goal here in New York, this coalition sort of represents all the people who I feel should be at the table, although I would love if the governor was listening. But I think we need to develop in New York a strategy whereby natural carbon solutions come into are formally recognized within the framework of New York's goals. I think the Climate Act that passed was wonderful. And I think for the state to really achieve net zero by 2050 and to achieve a lot of the steps along the way, we need to really understand the ecosystems of the state, which I am not claiming we fully understand yet. I think Nava would agree, but we're working hard to. And really assess what agriculture should mean for New York. I don't mean to be controversial, this may be, but we've been a state focused on industrial dairy. And they call it a $2 billion industry, but it costs us $2.2 billion every year. So it's really a $200 million loss and a big polluter. And we have a lot of land and wonderful ecological resources that I think could do much more to feed the people of New York and play an active role in meeting our climate goals that the state's so wonderfully written into law. So I really hope that we can find strong alliances between natural carbon solutions, alternative energy, and hopefully a national would be beautiful, but I think it's more realistic to find a statewide or regional carbon and ecosystem services market format to really help achieve these ambitious goals that the state has set. Again, I want to thank everyone for the opportunity. I feel there's too much to say, so I won't try to say too much further, but I look forward to the rest of the discussion, answering some questions, and thank you all again.
Thank you, Ben. I just want to just a special thank you to anybody that whose work is outside and in the field for being part of a summer panel. I am aware it's a busy time for all you folks with field work. Not to be thoroughly provocative, but when we talk about carbon markets and markets for for sequestering carbon. This gets into the accounting of carbon offsets, and this is something of a tricky area. What can we do? What can you do? And what can we all do if we're interested in this sort of solution to make sure that legitimate carbon sequestration efforts aren't just being used to give emitters more of a free pass to continue to pollute?
That's a great question. So traditional cap and trade has given emitters license to pollute X amount. I feel that emitters have to be put on the hook to offset all of their current emissions and a portion of past emissions. For example, and where I talk about markets, a real market has a real buyer and a real seller. So it's not a real market if you're just trading carbon to reduce emissions. It is a real market if a buyer is the carbon polluter and a seller is the carbon sequesterer, so that you actually have to draw carbon back down that's being emitted. Beyond that, there's a past perspective. We're at 420 parts per million of CO2 in our global atmosphere. We're on track to hit 500 by year 2050. And that basically spells a disaster. We're already seeing disasters in many parts of this planet. So I think that and it's a daunting task, but real markets have to have a real buyer and a real seller. And then they have to be, so if I work on these supply demand curves a lot, where if we're targeting specific ppm in the atmosphere, what would the price of carbon have to be? And then you actually have to fund real solutions that are verifiable. And there's a tremendous amount of work right now in a green rush in carbon markets, where many of our biggest culprits are racing to carbon markets to be, quote, carbon sellers. So we're seeing, I won't use any expletives, but we're seeing Cargill, we are seeing many of the worst actors race to try to claim that they are sequestering carbon. And one thing I will tell you from 6 or 7 years of research is we don't have an exact formula that works, but we're getting closer and closer. And in ecosystems, there is no exact, but there's rigor and there's honesty. And both of those are needed and then we also do have to hold our emitters to account. And my point is to achieve a goal like net zero by 2050. That would require every ton of carbon being emitted to either be replaced by a renewable or to have to pay for a complete offset. And then if we're ever going to try to get back to 350 parts per million, which is the safe level that we were at in 1980, we're going to have very ambitious carbon pricing. And it would basically spell the end to dirty industries and the new to clean and a new financial beginning for clean industries. So we really need to kind of turn the equation on its head, where we live in a financial system where money is generally created in what's called fractional reserve banking, and then that money gets to be used up to buy up resources. And economic growth is based on the throughput of raw natural resources. Since we sort of created a game to create money, I work with a lot of economists. I believe it's completely possible to place value on functioning ecosystems and on carbon being stored in the right place. It's a very tall order, but considering the seriousity of the outcomes, if we don't act, I feel it's all worth working towards. So I'm sorry for my long-winded answer. Your questions, carbon markets are right now trying to be used as an excuse for some of the worst actors. And we need to hold them account and say, well, sort of like most monopolies in America, they don't function in real markets. We need to make real markets that function the way the cycles work and place buyers and sellers at the right place in the cycle.
Before I turn it over to our next panelist, just one more quick question. You have, in some ways, a really enviable spot. You're a farmer, but you get to be a farm researcher. You get to. Is that accurate to say? You get to play with things and see what works on the farm, and be in the forefront of this field. For working farmers who aren't engaged in this research, who are looking for ways to make their practices, to bring either sequestration into the market or just to make their practices more environmentally friendly, where do you suggest that they can start?
So I feel the best place to start, there aren't many places. One is we always act as a resource to farms. So I visit farms, I provide advice, I share successes and failures. And I can for my first 12 years of my farming career, I didn't have an ounce of time to think about researching the outcomes of what I was doing. I think we do have more and more resources at the NRCS, but we need better trained extension agents. We need, I know here at Hudson Carbon, we want to do an education and outreach wing, but one thing we have been doing is scouring the Northeast this past year for the best practices being used on farms with ecological outcomes. And we've added actually 3 research sites off of our own farm. I'm not saying we have all the solutions, but I think that there are several now online resources too, with the Savory Institute. There is one, there are, we're about to, by the fall, have our website up with all of our research and studies so far to date. And then there are resources such as NOFA New York, who offer good resources and ideas. And then there several conferences, including the NOFA conference, where I think people can work. And more and more, I think Ray Archuleta with the USDA and his Understanding Ag group has a tremendous amount of resources. So there's a long list, but the main thing is, how do we help farmers make more money? And the best way is for us eaters to pay top dollar for good quality food. The more living a farmer can make, the more freedom they get to think about things differently and pursue new tracks. But it's a fundamentally important point you make. We need more resources for farmers, and farmers need a better living so they can make a little more time. Also, the Northeast Carbon Alliance that Scenic Hudson has launched, we helped a little bit at the beginning, but Nava and the team at Scenic Hudson have done a beautiful job, are building out lots of resources for understanding best practices on farm, wetland, forest, and how to be more resilient. So I think that's a great regional group that we should look to as well.
I also just wanted to mention that the legislature this year, this session, passed a soil health legislation. This is something that I was working on as the ag chair, and the new ag chair, Senator Hinchey, has really picked this up along with Donna Lepardo in the Assembly. And it's all aimed, and this is also an important part of the recommendations of the Agriculture and Forestry panel to the Climate Action Council too. But it's all about focusing on how we can improve soil health in New York State and making it possible for farmers to make the changes they need to make and that was going to be one of my questions for you, Ben, but we're probably running out of time. But just, just culturally in other ways, getting, and dealing with the financial risk of making that shift to change in practices is a big and real issue for farmers, many of whom are already living on the edge and are really not making a livable income. We need to keep growing our own food. So we need to support this transition somehow. And I think, what you've discussed is part of the solution. I think that there are probably other solutions as well. So
absolutely. I would say one more good example is the Watershed Agriculture Council has done a tremendous job of investing to work with farmers to protect New York City's water supply. And it's a great first, I think, a tremendous example for us to look at of how we could analyze the true value of the rest of New York State. And I just leave it with that we need to look at our land as something far more valuable than just the price on it. It's the future of our state and our livelihood and our interaction with the place we live. So and farmers aren't just a placeholder. They're there, and we need to work together. And economics are the best language to speak with farmers. We can provide viable economic alternatives. People will change. If you don't provide that, then talk is cheap, and that's what it sounds like to them. So,
having done a bunch of reporting on the Watershed Ag Council over the years, absolutely, and also they've been having some hiccups this past year with their programming. So hopefully something we can get into in the river. But yeah, no, this is great. We could clearly do a session just on this, and maybe sometime we should. But I'm going to keep us bumping along here and introduce Andrew Wilner, who has some really exciting stuff to talk to us about. Andrew has been a leader, organizer, and advocate for the New York, New Jersey bioregion for almost 40 years. He was an early proponent of the waterkeeper model of water and habitat protection as the founder, Baykeeper, and executive director of New York, New Jersey Baykeeper. He's currently the executive director of the Center for Post-Carbon Logistics, a principal for the consulting firm Andrew Wilner Sustainability Solutions, and from 2008 to 2014 was the principal professional consultant for energy, transportation, and the environment at the Hugo New Corporation. I have asked him here today to talk to us about sail freight and about a vision for zero carbon shipping on the Hudson River, much as it might have existed 200 years ago, but revisioned for a modern world. And Andrew is tremendously passionate about this, and I welcome him to tell us about his vision for what the Hudson is beginning to be and could fully be.
Thank you. I'm going to take a little bit of time to share my screen, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate. I just want to start with a statistic that when I started doing this work just completely floored me. If international shipping was a country, it would be the 6th largest emitter of carbon in the world. And I think that let's keep that in our heads as we talk about how we're going to change the way that we move people and goods from place to place by water in a carbon constrained future. I'm going to try to share the screen thing. There, and can you see that?
Unfortunately, no. Does not appear to be sharing slides.
Okay, let's try this.
Thanks for your patience with our technical. Oh, there we go.
Okay, and just let me.
On.
Okay, so very quickly, and I'll hope to answer questions at the end. So solar energy and the wind has powered cargo and freight vessels for more than 10,000 years. And until the mid-19th century was the only way to transport goods and people over any distance by water. Today, the wind and solar revolution is embedded in our adaptation to the climate crisis. Wind-powered and solar electric vessels are becoming more ubiquitous in the movement of goods and people. And the schooner Apollonia and the solar electric passenger vessel Solaris are the Hudson River's pioneering solar-powered freight and passenger vessels. And I will talk later a little bit about the Rondout River Port 2040 project, in which both several people on this call are involved, and I think is an important part of how we address climate change in our Hudson River ports. Building future-proof sail and solar electric freight and passenger vessels in the Hudson Valley is about locally built from locally sourced and recycled materials, crewed with locally trained mariners, home ported along the Hudson, the harbor, and the canals, carrying locally grown, locally processed, and locally manufactured goods. And with liberty from fossil fuels, these future-proof ships will be a positive disruption to the status quo. Rondout River Port 2040 is a regenerative port on the Rondout Creek. And I want to talk a little bit about how we get there. And one of the first things we have to do is objectively assess threats. And I'm going to quickly try to see if this works, but there's a GIS map that should come up in a second, that in which Scenic Hudson's information, EPA, DEC, and NOAA and National Marine Fisheries Service information was put together with interns from the Vassar College GIS program. This is the Rondout Creek, and these are the FEMA flood hazard zones. Now, in the creek, if you've ever been in there, it's kind of a little bit of a fjord. There's hills on both sides. And so therefore, a 500-year flood is the equivalent of a 2 to 4 foot sea level rise. These are some of the things that are going to be affected. I'm going to go through this very quickly, and I can share this map with anybody who's interested. These are properties that are in the 500-year flood, and these are Ulster County tax maps. So anything you see in blue here or in light blue are submerged with 2 to 4 feet of sea level rise. This is taking it down to a smaller level, and you can see that these properties are affected, including wetlands and including the part the park on the Hudson in Kingston that will essentially become an island by mid-century if the predictions hold true. And then these are some of the buildings and facilities that are at risk. I can share this map with anybody who wants to take a closer look, but it is pretty damning information, and we have to be when Kingston has conversations about this, sometimes I think that they're not going deeply enough. For example, with this scenario, the sewage treatment plant will be underwater and inoperable by mid-century. So that's a huge amount of money that the city is going to have to start to put into infrastructure. Should we pursue politics and policy as usual, we're likely to face a grimmer reality. Abandoned, flooded, moldering buildings and piers, failing low-lying sewage treatment plants and electric utilities, climate change and rising sea level driven migrants crowding upstate communities. So these future-proof ships will need piers, warehouses, trading houses, training facilities, and first and last mile logistics providers. Ports on the Hudson and New York's canals will need to adapt to sea level rise and climate change. And this placemaking process that we're envisioning for the Rondout Riverport 2040 project will help to let the people most affected by climate change be the ones who determine what their waterfront will look like. The Rondout Riverport 2040 proposes a pragmatic, positive, and prosperous vision for the near future in which the communities of Kingston and Esopus are enriched by a transformed port, boasting a shoreline synergy of leading-edge maritime commerce and working waterfront technologies that profit and engage individuals, businesses, and communities, allowing for the equitable transition beyond fossil fuels as together we forge a vital and vibrant economic bond with the greater Hudson Valley bioregion. We've put together a coalition of organizations that is working on this issue, and hopefully, because this is recorded, some of the links here will help you get more information about each of these things that I've talked about. And I'll leave it there and look forward to questions. And I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just looking through the chat here, multitasking away. So the schooner Apollonia, which you mentioned, has been already done one run and is about to do another. Is that right?
Yeah, that's true. And the Apollonia is becoming part of this whole idea of a new logistics or a post-carbon logistics, because in their last trip to New York City, where they stopped along the way to deliver malted barley to breweries as their main cargo, but they had many other cargoes, also met up in New York City in a pier in Brooklyn with Grain de Sail, excuse my French pronunciation, but Grain de Sail is a purpose-built transatlantic sail freighter that delivered French chocolates and fine wines and cognac to New York City buyers. And so they did a cross dock, and on the return voyage, Apollonia, a 65-foot steel schooner, for those of you who don't know it, that is home ported in Hudson and Kingston, delivered chocolates and cognacs to Hudson Valley customers. So with that and the use of first and last mile logistics using cargo bikes we have the very beginning of a post-carbon logistics system being developed in the Hudson. And with new ships and with help from hopefully from some state agencies and the Maritime Administration, we can start building these ships in Hudson Valley yards for Hudson Valley mariners for transporting goods and people up and down the Hudson River.
What should be what's the ideal balance here, given that the state is pushing hard to electrify vehicle fleets also? You know, what kind of balance of energy should we be spending on you know, water solutions versus decarbonizing our kind of existing transit system and transportation of goods system? And what's the value of leaning into you know, reviving these older technologies?
I guess the one of the things that enlightened me was that waterborne transport is one of the few things, except for bicycles, that doesn't need a lot of infrastructure. So you know, the waterways exist, the Hudson exists, the harbor exists, the oceans exist, the canals are there in place. And the maintenance of those things is significantly lower than maintaining roads and railroads. We have a history of the Hudson River being a river highway, and we have ports that once maintained an extraordinarily busy waterways, you know, highway system up until the middle of the 19th century, with the advent of economical fossil fuels and steam engines, were the only way that things got delivered back and forth. So the answer is that we have to address all of these things, but water transportation is low-hanging fruit.
Thanks so much, Andrew.
That was really, so shall I introduce our next guest, our next panelist?
Go for it. Go for it.
All right. So another panelist I know from way back, Melinda Mcknight. Melinda Turpentine Mcknight is an Ulster County native. She has a master's degree in public history and worked in the museum field for 25 years. I didn't know that, actually. She is Vice President, Chief Financial Officer, and Building Science Advisor of Energy Conservation Services, a family-owned company that transitions buildings off fossil fuels. Melinda believes in giving back to the community and has a long history of civic as well as community service. She currently serves on the kitchen cabinet of Citizens for Local Power and sits on the town board in the town of Hurley. Take it away, Melinda.
Thanks.
And good to see you again.
You as well. Thank you for all the hard work that you did on CLCPA, and I appreciate that. So we can't really talk about achieving climate goals without really talking about reducing consumption. The drive to green the grid has meant really switching over to electrifying heating inside homes. And in order for that to really be effective, it really is, I can't even stress enough how important it is to really get to the bottom of where air leaks are and where buildings are losing energy, and where the air that you pay to heat and cool is leaving. So reducing carbon in emissions from buildings, Senator Metzger is right, is a really thorny issue when you talk about weatherizing buildings. So according to a statistic I heard at a NYSERDA conference, we need to weatherize 750 buildings per day for 30 years in New York State in order to bring down emissions sufficiently. That is a tall order. There really are not enough building science-based companies to do that work. What I've seen is a trend of the state toward using kind of a one-size-fits-all approach of treating all types of, all kinds of, I'm sorry, I'm saying this clumsily here, So each building of type the same. So in essence, a raised ranch the same, a Cape Cod the same. And that really is not the best approach, because the same style building built by the same builder will inevitably have sometimes incredible differences in where he is escaping and where fresh air is coming in. When we talk about the amount of carbon dioxide that is being emitted into the atmosphere and increasing in our outdoor air, it really is part of that comes from heating buildings. And just a really quick story, we rent an office space where indoor air quality was incredibly bad. We all felt terrible inside there. And we did a test, and the indoor air was, we had about 1,500 parts per million of carbon dioxide. Really unhealthy, incredibly bad health effects, a lot of fatigue, foggy thinking, and things like that. They changed out the heating system, and that instantly dropped. Unfortunately, they didn't address the building envelope. So we still had fiberglass in the attic, and so unfortunately that didn't get addressed. I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways that we can incentivize weatherization and air sealing particularly. I think having contractors and people who actually do the work, having a seat at the table to talk about practical application would be a really big step in the right direction. And we're not talking about, yes, it's a thorny issue in some ways because of the amount of building stock. So there's a magnitude problem, but I think really addressing the problem in a nutshell is really quite simple. It really is finding a way to get folks to address their attic, get rid of old insulation that isn't working well, helping folks understand that certain insulation materials just don't work without air sealing, what effective air sealing measures are. You know, traditionally the leaky spots are top plates and recessed lights, bathroom vent fans, you know, plumbing penetrations, electrical penetrations, and then rim joists on the underside of the building, crawl spaces and things like that. These are very effective methods really to bring down the amount of energy buildings use, and also improves the comfort, health, and safety of the building occupants. So yeah, it's complicated. On the flip side, it's actually a little bit more simple, so.
Thanks, Melinda. It's funny. I live in let's see, it's 140-year-old house. And we have been working over the years to try to really make improvements to the building envelope. And you're absolutely right. I mean, every building is different. That's like that's one of the most challenging aspects of reducing building emissions. It's like, the power plant sector, they're power plants, the transportation, it's an oligopolistic industry. They all basically, a small group of companies have to change their emission standards, at least to deal with vehicle emissions, tailpipe emissions. But buildings, every building is unique, and to put it just in perspective, there's something like 5 million single family homes in New York State. 3/4 of the buildings, as I mentioned, were built before there were energy codes. So that's critical. It's a major investment. And it does have all these other benefits in terms of reducing. It can really drastically reduce the operational costs of a house. Dramatically. And there are many people paying a huge percentage of their income in energy bills alone. So It is big, but it seems like, I mean, just in your experience talking with building owners, being on building sites, I mean, is it like the upfront capital investment that is, do you see as like our biggest barrier? Are there other barriers? You mentioned workforce, which is huge. Like workforce development is huge. We definitely do not have the skilled workforce in like, you know, to do the work that your company does and others yet. We just don't have it yet because we haven't had the demand. So that's going to be a huge area of investment for New York State in building that trained workforce. But, you know, are there what other barriers do you see, and what do you think is the biggest to getting a building occupant to make those investments?
I think that, yeah, I mean, cost is certainly a barrier, although we do everything that we can to try to reduce that. You know, we'll break down a project into small doable parts. We offer some 0% financing and things like that. So, you know, I think oftentimes we're able to work with folks enough so that they will go ahead. If nothing else, I mean, a lot of the driving force really is health and safety. You know, if people don't feel well in their homes and they're constantly sick, that can be a real catalyst to get them to move or not being comfortable.
Right.
Workforce is another one for sure. I think the biggest thing is that this field is really, no one knows about it. There really hasn't been a demand generated, and I think the state programs did, you know, make a bit of a difference, but I really feel like there needs to be a major like public service announcement campaign to get folks to start to think about, you know, if you're not comfortable in your home, it may not be your HVAC system.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, I entirely agree with you. The public education and understanding of that outreach is like a critical piece, actually across all the climate kind of challenges, but with buildings especially. And Marcy posted in the chat existing NYSERDA programs, the Empower program, assisted home performance programs. I mean, the Empower program is amazing. It's free upgrades and what's interesting about it, there's a huge problem with what's called the split incentive, which I'm sure, you know, you're aware of, where the owner of the building doesn't live in the building and doesn't pay the bills necessarily, and doesn't have the incentive to make the investment in improvements that benefit renters. And the Empower program actually provides assistance based on the renter's income. So if the renter is low income, you get free upgrades to your building, which is pretty amazing. But the uptake of that program is not nearly at the scale that it needs to be. But expanding those programs, expanding knowledge about them is really important. But, you know, almost half of New York State households are low to moderate income. So there's a major income challenge to making these investments. They will benefit everyone who lives in these homes when they're made, but we have to make it financially viable in New York State for that to happen. And I will just make a plug. We're making a big push right now to get investments in housing as part of this federal infrastructure bill. So let your Congress people know that that's important to you, because that gets at the nexus of equity, environmental justice, and climate, you know, so here, just. Yeah.
I think there, you know, really part of the problem too is that there really aren't enough participating contractors in the program. It's also very administrative and oftentimes requires a full energy audit before a project is even proposed. And that step isn't really necessary. I mean, it's essential to do a blower door before work begins, but I think, you know, it's not necessarily to have a full energy audit before doing work. So
state programs may be designed in a way that make it difficult to access them.
Yeah, I do also want to say that my home is a 1960 building built when IBM came in, and I'm fossil fuel free. and comfortable. So, and we do a lot of work on historic buildings. So we're also happy to advise. I mean, there's plenty of work to go around. You know, this isn't for us really about the generating a profit or doing that kind of thing. It's more about really consulting, helping folks, even plot a path forward, right? Just to be able to figure out how do you get to fossil fuel free.
Right. And it is going to be the biggest source of green jobs in New York. It's already the biggest single source of green jobs in New York, and it will continue to be because it's labor intensive work. So
we have a very difficult time finding field help. So yeah, we're hiring if anybody's interested.
I'll let my kids know.
Melinda, it's amazing to me that any building in upstate New York can be fossil fuel free, and we've gone in a pretty short span of time from, you know, things like heat pumps and geothermal sounding like space technology to, oh, it's here and it's actively being rolled out. It works. It's not, you know, this is not some sort of futuristic technology, but this is, you know, this is a real way forward for people. I remember going to a Dandelion presentation about you know, about heat pump installations some years ago, and it almost felt like, you know, what is this? But you know, the technology has really made leaps and bounds and caught on in a bigger way. And so now I think, you know, there's another huge challenge in making that technology financially accessible, logistically accessible to people. But you know, like you said, we have the solutions that work even in our incredibly cold, difficult climate. Again, here's another topic we could continue to go on for a session, but I want to keep bumping along because we have two more speakers here. I'm very happy to introduce Aaron Bennett, who works for the Ulster County Department of Environment. He is a certified floodplain manager, which is an incredibly difficult job. Following the devastation caused by tropical storms Irene and Lee in 2011, the county created an environmental planner position, which Aaron now holds, to provide direct assistance to local municipalities and county government to become more resilient to future floods. Aaron is going to talk to us about a crucial project in a proactive community where, despite several bumps in the road, a critical community facility is going to be rebuilt outside of the floodplain. And I'm gonna do my best here, Aaron. I'm gonna try to share your slides while you are talking, and we'll see if we can make this work. But if not, you know, we'll have your lovely face to look at.
Okay. All right. Thanks. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lissa. Yeah, I you know, a number of the panelists so far have been talking about incentives and talking to your congressmen and your state representatives, and I think that really is really critical for for things like what I'm going to talk about with critical facilities in the Catskills, in the north western part of Ulster County. You know, I think I'd say, I don't know exactly what percentage, but a lot of the critical community facilities are located within the floodplain. And, you know, I shared some visuals here with Lissa to share as sort of to keep me on track here. You know, so after Tropical Storm Irene, which we're coming up on, you know, in a month, the 10-year anniversary of, and, you know, some of these communities get hit in different, you know, we just on Christmas Day up in the northwestern part of the county, we had like what amounted to a 10-year flood event on the upper Esopus and had some flooding and evacuations and things. So it's, you know, we all know flooding is going to, you know, increase in terms of frequency and intensity. And so we do have to be prepared to that. And so, you know, after Tropical Storm Irene, in the New York City watershed portion of Ulster County, there was a movement to really to invest in some of these proactive mitigation measures so that this does not keep happening, because up there in the hills, it happens over and over again, as I'm sure many of you know. And, here's a chance with dollars that were allocated through New York City, advocated for by each of the counties and the local towns, to start to do this. And so my position was really, we advocated for that to help the local communities and the county itself become more resilient to future flooding. And so a lot goes into that. There's a whole engineering and feasibility study called a local flood analysis that was funded, that really works in population centers and talks about, what can communities do and what are the dollars needed in order to do these type of projects, so that but still have a community. There's a number I could talk about, but I want to focus on, because the time is limited, the Hamlet of Boysville, and that's in the town of Olive, and the picture you're seeing there is on Route 28, just west of Kingston and east of Phoenicia, during the height of Irene, which was about a 70-year storm in that event. And the building in the upper left is the Olive Fire Department, the Boysville Company, company number 5. And that's the third time since 1980 that building has been surrounded by flooding. And as some of you may know, it's a stone's throw from the local high school. And so it's a pretty critical asset for the town. And so, there was this flood study that was done, this local flood analysis, and the number one recommendation that came out of that was to relocate that facility. There were several others I'm not going to get into, but basically you can see from the flood map below, that's a depth grid, and I circled the firehouse there. That's during the 100-year flood event, is several feet of water all around that structure. Critical community facilities really need to be protected at the 500-year flood level, and which is impossible in that location. You're talking 12 to 13 feet of water in the Hamlet of Boysville. There, it's like a big bathtub, and so it's impossible. So the only option is to relocate it. And so, because of that, because it was identified in the county's hazard mitigation plan as a top recommendation, even in the New York Rising, some of you remember that program. And so there was a lot of community support in order to make this happen. And so now it's just a matter of finding the money to do it. So what's my next slide, Liz? I can't remember if you can advance it one. Yeah, okay. So there's a lot of community support, and there's the top recommendation from that. And so, now it's a matter of going out and getting the funding. The local funding we have, it's a local program that only communities can apply for, and it did meet that, but it's limited, and it was always meant when it was developed to pair with state or federal money. You have New York City dollars, it's a perfect match for these grant programs. So you see on the map there, there's the firehouse, and so after several years of looking and asking, we did get, the local fire department did get a flood hazard mitigation grant through an entity called the Catskill Watershed Corporation, who does, economic development in the New York City watershed. They had to create this new program to disseminate the flood mitigation money. And so we found a parcel of land that was subdivided off. They got the money to buy the land, which is a start. It doesn't get anywhere near the number that we need to be. So they had an architect they've worked with before. They had the parcel of land pretty much set up. And so I helped them apply to the community Climate Smart Communities grant program in 2019 for about half of the money that was needed, about 1.3 at the time. 1.3 million was the total budget. We applied for a little over 700,000 of that. We had the land already acquired, and unfortunately the program didn't work, and it scored incredibly high. Everybody seemed to love the program, the effort, the project. The problem was that in that program, because the money comes from the Environmental Protection Fund, the municipality, the town of Olive, even though they were the applicant, they had to own in the future the firehouse and the fire the fire district has a contract that works, that with the town to provide that protection service. So in the end, the town didn't want to own the building, and that for that only reason is why that funding wasn't approved at the state level. So again, here's an example of, maybe there's a way to come up with an easier way to make these critical community facilities, which aren't always owned by municipalities, eligible for some of this funding, because they had the other half of the money. I forgot to mention that, through the same Catskill Watershed Corporation. So it just needed the other half from the state, and it would have been good to go. Similarly, with FEMA dollars, what's the next slide? Let's, if you don't mind. Okay, so here's the, I'll talk through this. This is just a really quick rendering of the initial drawing and design. There's the location of the land. They cleared it. They put a sign up there for the future home of, and then a site drawing. It's been way more beyond that now. But however, with FEMA dollars, these pre-disaster mitigation grants, that was the, okay, well, there's FEMA money out there. I learned two things. One, well, we knew the benefit cost in rural communities is a real stretch, and we knew that was going to be a tough one to prove or to justify. But the other ones is FEMA will fund the reconstruction of a building if it's located on the same parcel, which there, as you saw the flood depth map, it's impossible. The whole parcel, the whole 1 acre parcel is under 6 feet of water at a 100-year storm. Impossible to put a building there, a firehouse there. The other thing that FEMA will fund is the physically picking up the building and moving it to a new parcel like they have. The problem is it's a brick building with no basement, and it's possible to, I guess, relocate those. It's very rare, and it just a non-starter for this group. So FEMA money out the window, state money out the window. So what they've decided to do is they're going to go get some loans through New York State, and they're not going to stop. We've had some bumps in the road, but they know that they don't want to leave this money on the table. They have half the money they need. Post-pandemic, the cost went from 1.4 to it's now 1.7 or 8 million. And they just went back to that same entity, the city dollars, which is funneled through the Catskill Watershed Corporation, for another ask of about 250 million, or it's not, sorry, 250,000, because of the post-pandemic costs. And that is in the process of being hopefully approved at the board meeting. So they're dedicated to doing it. It's all volunteers. The board members are all, that are working on this are in their 70s. It's just something that they're not going to give up on. They know this is pretty much their only shot in order to do this. And so they're going to give it a go. And so luckily I've been thankful to be involved and help them out however I can to do this. But again, communities relocating critical facilities, it's not an easy task with, especially in places like the Catskills where there's little land, little opportunities for land, and access to federal dollars because it's so rural is tough. But I think other communities, like you mentioned, Kingston, Catskill, Piermont, some of those other areas would have a bit more, better shot at some of this. So I don't know. I don't think I had any other slides to talk through, but I'll leave it at that.
One more, but I just want to note that we're getting up on the time. I did want to, there's, when you think of communities at the forefront of taking action on resilience and climate change and, really taking all this stuff seriously, you don't necessarily think of like the Olive Town Board and the Olive Fire Department. And I just, I'm so glad that you're here to talk about this. This work is absolutely going on in the deep rural parts of the state, in the littlest communities in the state, and it's absolutely necessary there. The tenacity of this group that is working on this project is kind of amazing to me, having, encountered barriers to FEMA funding and barriers to state funding that really have nothing to do with the value of the project and the necessity of the project. And from where you sit as a planner, what does the state need to do in order to, to remove some of these you know, these hurdles for communities that absolutely want to engage in the process but are not ticking some box?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, they've come up with, through the CARA Act and things, they've come up with the model local laws and given some direction and guidance. But again, it's more of, you know, I think it's on the ground assistance, you know, which I know, you know, that's why my position in Ulster County is there, because of that hand holding and that local technical knowledge and assistance, GIS, whatever, grant writing, things like that these towns don't have, a lot of them. But it's, you know, funding would easier, you know, if you have Climate Smart Communities grant program and the climate and an adaptation project where it talks about relocating critical facilities out of the floodplain, it seems like this should be fundable some way, shape, or form. So it's just maybe a little tweak of some, I don't know, language here or there, but it just seems, I mean, it seems like, you know, if the state is all in on this, and I believe that they are, then they're gonna have to do a little bit more to these smaller communities that are just gonna have a heck of a lot tougher time. And yeah, the damage numbers might not be as big as they are in some of the populated places right on the coast, or, you know, on the Hudson River, but these are, you know, roads and you know, these are lifelines for these rural communities, as we saw during Irene, you know, places being cut off for days because, you know, a bridge washed out or a firehouse being inaccessible. That's where people know to go. So yeah.
Thanks so much, Aaron. I'm
Yeah,
going to turn it over to Jen to introduce our last panelist here.
I was just chatting to everyone to say, stick around for Rich, because it's certainly last but not least. So I had the great pleasure of representing Rich when I was in the state Senate and getting to know his work there, and was so impressed and thrilled by the work that his company is doing to build out community distributed renewables. And I want to congratulate you, Rich, on the Bethel project. I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's the largest community renewable project to date. So, you know, very exciting. But Rich Winter is CEO and co-founder of Delaware River Solar, a leading community solar developer dedicated to bringing renewable energy to the western part of New York State. DRS has developed more than 200 megawatts in New York to date, and has more than 300 megawatts currently under development. That is a lot. Prior to his work with DRS, Rich worked at Auriga Capital Management and Zerta Energy, I hope I said that right, which helped finance solar projects via solar renewable energy credits, or SRECs, which we don't have here, but they do in other did have in Massachusetts and other states. The recently interconnected Bethel project on 17B at the Pete Hofste Farm is the 12th system DRS has developed and built in Sullivan County, which has special meaning for the Winter family, as they have had a home in the county since 2006 and owned and operated a grass-fed and finished beef farm since 2011. In addition to its development activities, DRS is promoting the implementation of community choice aggregation program, allowing entire towns to easily pass along the benefits of renewable energy to its citizens. As am I. It'd be a very good project innovation. So Rich, welcome.
Thank
and you. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Okay. We started in 2016. We're, as you read, we're a community solar developer. We are fully integrated. We do everything from finding the land and the site to getting the permits and working with the town. And then we do the construction. After construction, we do the subscriptions. We find people to subscribe to the arrays. That's how community solar works. Then we manage those customers long-term, as well as the systems themselves. And we actually do the management of the sheep. I know somebody asked whether we use sheep. In fact, we have a full-time person whose job is solely to manage, move sheep, and get them on and off sites. So we do everything front to back. As of currently have a little more than 10,000 subscribers. By the end of this year, we'll have close to 25,000. subscribers across the systems that we either own ourselves. We own what we can. We're a small company, so we own what we can. And then the rest, we have partners. We're fortunate to have partners who are committed to owning the systems for their life, long-term, open-ended green energy funds, including the Generate Capital, who is the one who owns the one in Bethel. So as you noted, yesterday was the ribbon cutting. Lieutenant Governor came. There's some links if you'd like to see what myself looks like. My kids came. If you'd like to see what my children look like. And then, I'm happy to answer any questions. I know we're running late, so I won't speak too much.
Well, thanks, Rich. And I actually want to start with a question for you. So, there has been a lot of pushback locally to the siting of projects in many parts of the state. And, a lot of it has been to the larger scale projects, but, also to community renewable projects. There was, just in my, right in my immediate area, there was some pushback to some community development, renewable developments there. And just, have you experienced that with your projects? Have you dealt with it? And do you believe that, by serving the local community directly with these projects, that, that would increase community acceptance?
A lot there. We've definitely run into resistance in citing some projects. There is some of the NIMBY things, as well as some projects are cited poorly. End of the day, part of the, what we face is that we have to connect to certain types of infrastructure. The grid is older. So when you combine that, there's only certain types of lines. The lines have to have what's called three-phase. So if you look up and there's 3 lines, we could connect to them. So that limits places. And then further that, some substations are not in great shape. So the cost to upgrade them to handle this new energy is prohibitive. So we're limited on where we can put some of them. We do run into that. We try and look for alternative sites. We always meet with the town prior. We'll never, it's not worth it from a business standpoint, but also just not worth it from a personal standpoint to go into a town that doesn't want us there. There's only been 1 or 2 towns that have outright said, we really don't want you here. We have one town that said that to me 3 years ago, which actually now has invited us back. The folks who had, they voted those folks out up in the Rochester area. I won't name the town, but so we're back. So we'll look for different parcels if we can. I'd say the bigger pushback now is about farmland, and are we using up good farmland? As a person who has a farm, I think the key issue here is not to conflate the issues of farmland and farmers. And what's happening right now is that there's part of the government that is about farmland, and then there's people who are advocating for farmers. And the people who are advocating for farmland aren't concerned whether the land's being farmed. And I'll give an example. Yesterday, Pete Hofstee was very clear that he would be losing his farm if he didn't have a solar array there to supplement his income. And I can list, again, we're in Western New York, so 90% of our stuff is on farmland. We're not saying every farmer who's got a solar array isn't being saved from going bankrupt, but I would say 20% are farms that would be up for development in the next 10 years if they didn't have the income from the solar array. So Pete said it best, he's milking the sun now instead of milking cows, and which I thought was pretty funny. But every farm, and that's where I was referring to myself, every farmer has 20 or 30 acres in a 100-acre type farm that he doesn't really want to farm. And that is not as productive as the rest of it. And that's where we should site it. And if it's a little further away from the interconnection point, so be it. But there's going to be a place where the value of the solar is more than hay or corn or something else. And so I fight a little bit back when I hear about it's strictly about prime soils or it's strictly about something else. I think it needs to be about, is there a farmer there right now? And is he engaged and wants to be there long-term, but can't be? And so we have that in mind when we look for sites.
Well, it's great that you have that in mind. And actually that got to another question I had. And I'm actually on a new technical advisory committee to NYSERDA to try to reconcile and make sure that we're responsibly citing solar vis-a-vis, also protecting agriculture, farming, the like. But that question, that issue, and is an important one that you hit upon, which is a lot of farmers are struggling to stay in business, and the rent can provide stable, predictable income to supplement and reduce the risk of, unpredictable weather patterns and other influences on their income. So it's like, but you have to find those, it's like matchmaking those situations. I feel like that's critical. And what you don't want to see happen is it necessarily is renewable development displacing people renting farms, or renter, because that's a huge a huge issue is farmers who rent having a hard time finding land that they can afford to rent. So I love that you seek that out. And I think that it is also about just being being local. You're investing in communities that you live in. And I think that probably makes a difference too. But if there's a way to kind of encourage that generally industry, I don't know, still trying to figure out how that would work, but to maximize those mutually beneficial arrangements, I think is really important for helping to sustain agriculture.
I agree. And I would just add quickly, if I could, that the farmland is not disappearing. In 30 years, when we take the stuff off, it'll still be farmland. And so, and there's farming things happening, whether it's sheep or, we plant a lot of stuff that attracts pollinators and things like that under the panel. So there's still things going on that maybe you don't see a tractor going by and baling up hay, but I would say that there's still things that are agricultural happening, and we're not destroying the farmland. We're using it for something else for a period of time, and then hopefully 30 years from now we can create that same amount of energy in a quarter of the space or an eighth of the space.
Yeah. There's a question from Jeff Demansky to you, or to us, I guess, but how would you address concerns expressed by municipal leadership that the recent siting changes take away their home rule power? I just want to first just clarify that those siting rules only apply to large utility scale projects. I mean, it applies to projects 25 megawatts or greater, optionally to 20 megawatts to 25 megawatts. But Rich, your projects tend to be what, in the 2 to 6, right? It's community, so it's a different scale of project.
That's right. Our projects all go through the town.
Yeah, but you do outreach. You do outreach to the town on your own. You had mentioned, which is another thing that I think is really important, to go that extra mile and do community outreach about the project too.
Yeah, pre-COVID, I went to all the towns. I will say on the large scale siting, I think that is that's a big question, which I will defer for another time. But I will say that there is towns are supposed to be the permitting entities, and this changes that dynamic. I understand why, but that needs to be resolved right now, I'd say.
Yeah, it's a sticky one.
Yeah, it is. As my son says, it's a sticky wicket. That one.
It's a sticky wicket.
And Jen, if I can just add something, because first of all, I totally agree. It's not a permanent land conversion. And also we've done some back of the envelope calculations for the Hudson Valley. And even if we sited all of the solar we need, there would still be, it's a small portion of the farmland. So it's kind of nice to zoom out and look at how much there is. And I think, like Rich said, it's more about the farmers and what they need in each case specifically. There's also a misconception that's, it's been voiced in the chat that I wanted to address. Solar panels do not compact soil and do not create erosion and runoff if they're installed properly. They're not impervious surface on the soil. And in fact, some land that is very intensively farmed as conventional agriculture can actually rest under solar panels. So, people have a lot of ideas about solar that are negative, and we really need to see it for the true development type that it is, which has impacts, no doubt, but it also has much fewer impacts than other types of development.
Yeah, thank you for that point, Nava. That was a really important point. And Liz, I don't know, we're really running out of time, but I don't know if we could address the community choice aggregation questions that came up earlier, if there's time, or we should save it for.
I feel like maybe we might have to have a whole other panel on community choice aggregation, because it's a dense topic, and
it's a dense topic. Yeah,
it's a dense topic, and we're going over time, and maybe we can say, we've piqued people's interest with this. Certainly piqued mine as a reporter. I want to dig into community choice aggregation and find out more about the municipalities that are really pursuing it, what the hurdles are there, and what the issues are, and also into this issue of solar siting. Is there a way that we can, when I say we, I mean, people in communities, or people who are involved in municipal government or have an interest in this, can be a little more proactive about not just saying, well, we don't want this project here, but identifying places where that kind of thing could live. There's a lot here. There's a lot here to get into, and we've got to wrap this up, unfortunately. But I think that we've covered a lot of ground. I want to thank everybody that has participated and that has stuck with us through this incredible smorgasbord. And I hope that this has given people a taste for what's happening on the ground. This is not. There's a lot of hopelessness in climate talk. There's a lot of focus on people's individual choices of, do I turn my thermostat down, or do I have this cup of coffee? And it's sort of, it's not entirely irrelevant, but this, the world of climate is so much larger and so much deeper and so much more interesting and proactive than that. We have a lot of tough problems to solve, but it is very heartening to see all of this dedicated energy going into really tackling them already. And I want to thank everyone who participated, and especially our panelists and Jen for making this such a good conversation. Is there anything else you wanted to add before I release you all into the internet?
I just want to thank you, Lissa, and the River again for this, and all of the panelists. And it was just fascinating, and I really look forward to the future programming through the new Climate Lab. It's a great way to kick it off.
We've had this is our second River event. We had one on affordable housing and the housing crisis. It was a fantastic success, and we hope to do more like this. And we're looking for more ways to keep this community conversation going. So we'll be in touch. We're going to make a recording of this event available to anybody who wants it, who participated tonight. And we hope that you will support the River Newsroom with your reading, and also, if you can, with your money. Our stories are free to read, and you can find us at therivernewsroom.com. You can sign up for our email newsletter, and we will send you our content on local stories that have national importance, or even international, and in this case, climate change is very global. So thank you all so much for being with us tonight. And I think we will bid you farewell.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you all.